Welcome to the Inspire to Invest podcast, where we're sharing stories from real estate investors and how investing has changed their lives. This episode of the Inspire to Invest podcast has been brought to you by Plentitude Inc. Hey everybody, welcome to the Inspire to Invest podcast. I'm excited to have Judi Paré here with us. And if you were turning in last fall, she did join us to have a little discussion on how she got started in real estate and how she scaled her portfolio. So I'll fill you guys in just in case you didn't catch that episode. But she's been in real estate since 2014, and she's been a coach for investors for the past 8 years. She's a highly respected and trusted coach, including one of mine, with a large network of peers and colleagues in real estate sales and development. She's always on the pulse looking for the best investment and education opportunities to provide to her partners as well as her students. And when she's not working, she can be found at one of her vacation properties in either Northern Ontario or Italy, which is pretty amazing. She loves to travel the world. Thanks for joining us again on Inspire to Invest. And we're just going to dive right into it. And we're going to talk about affordable housing and a big topic, which is due diligence for real estate investors right now. How are you today, Judi?
Awesome. That's great. Thank you. Thank you for having me back.
So obviously last time we did talk about how you got started into real estate, and really you've built this very significant portfolio over the last few years. But I know for you, one of the things that's really, really important and close to your heart is the topic of affordable housing. So maybe you can talk about why you feel like this is so important and how you're integrating it into your real estate portfolio.
Yeah, so I think a lot of people don't know this about me is in 1997, I had gone through a separation. 1996, I had gone through separation. 97, early part of the year, my house was up for sale. It was, we could no longer afford it. We had an income property in it. Our nanny lived in it. And that's how we were able to afford daycare, to be honest, as we had a live-in nanny. I was a flight attendant at the time, so I was traveling all the time and needed somebody to have full-time care for my kids when my husband was working and when I was working. And with the breakdown of the marriage, there's a couple of things that happen that put people at risk. One or two paychecks away, or the majority of our population, let's say more than 1/3 of Canadians live in unaffordable housing. I was in the same situation. We were paying more than half of what we were making into our mortgage. These are back in the times when mortgage interest rates were, 12, 13, 14%, right?
Yeah.
And when my husband and I separated, what I was a bit of a money moron, to be perfectly honest. I didn't understand where the money was going. The money would show up, from my paycheck into our bank account, and it was a joint bank account, and it would pay our mortgage, and it would just set up automatically, right? So when we separated, I was now responsible for handling the finances and doing these things. And I just thought things would happen automatically. And they didn't quite happen that way. And money was being moved around our accounts and whatnot. And one day I came home from work. We got a demand letter that said that we owed, I was alone with the kids, and we got a demand letter that said that we owed almost $14,000 in arrears in mortgages that hadn't been paid. And so as a single mom, $14,000 is not something I could come up with easily. Yeah. I barely had a credit card with, a $5,000 limit. My family wasn't very well off. I just didn't have resources for that kind of money. So I was, I was a bit taken aback. I was like, how is this happening that I owe this much in mortgages? And what I didn't know is my mortgage wasn't being paid. It was, my money was going into the bank account. My husband had bought a house. His mortgage was being paid. There was some complications in the way we were setting up our banking. And I wasn't aware. I literally wasn't aware. There's no excuse for it, but I really wasn't on the pulse of my money. I didn't understand money at the time. So yes, I came home from, the children came off the bus, and I was waiting for them in the driveway. And when I went to get into the house, I walked up to the door with the kids in tow, and I couldn't get into my own house. I was completely locked out. There was a sign on the door that said that the house had been taken over by the lender, and who to contact if you had any questions. And I went to the back door, and I went to the side door where my nanny's entrance was, and all of the locks had been changed. So there was no way in my house. And I contacted my son's school, he was coming off the bus a little bit later. And so I asked if he could take the bus to a friend's house
Yeah.
and stay at the friend's house. My youngest was in days, so they were home a lot earlier. So the oldest one I sent to a friend's house, and I called the parents and asked if he could stay for the weekend because it was nearing the weekend.
Yeah.
And so they were going to provide him with clothes and lunches and all of that for the last couple of days of that week so that he could stay with them. So, because we had nowhere to go. I guess we could have gone with family, but we had nowhere to go. My nanny was locked out, so I lost daycare immediately and put her into homelessness as well. And we had nowhere that we could go. So on the note, there was an address and there was a person to contact. And I went to their office, which was in London, Ontario, and I took my 2 kids in tow with me. Yeah. And I sat there until somebody would speak to me. And that day I begged for my house back and they wouldn't give it to me. And I kept begging and begging. And they said that they were going to assign a property manager to and that they would be managing it and I would have to contact the property manager to make arrangements to get my things out, etc. So what ended up happening that day is I became a property manager and I negotiated with them the keys back and I became the property manager of my own house and worked with the lender for the next few months in making sure the house was clean, the yard was done, everything was packed up and ready for us to move out. Yeah. And I negotiated that we could stay until the end of the school year. And this was in May. So I negotiated just to go that.
Back, did they ever send you any notices or anything like that in regards to like the payments?
Yeah. So a notice did come. I didn't receive it. It was rerouted to another individual who lived in the home, who didn't open them. Just thought, oh, I'm not going to open these things. This is, sometimes when you're going through financial trouble, you don't open your bills. You don't open statements. You don't do this. And a lot of people do that and put their head in the sand.
Oh my gosh.
And that's what's happening is our head was in the sand. We had a sale of the house. So we were going to move anyway. Like we were going to move. I was already looking for a place to live. Yeah. But our sale fell through. It was a conditional offer. It fell through and no other sale came through. So during this time, we weren't paying the mortgage. It wasn't being paid. Yeah. And we really felt that the sale of the house was going to take care of that. And this was our lack of understanding of really home ownership and what the sale process is. And we didn't know. It was our first home. We didn't know how it worked. And we ended up, my husband had already moved. He already had a house of his own, but me and my children ended up with nowhere. And so that day I negotiated my little heart out and I ended up with the keys back in an agreement that I would property manage it for it and an exit strategy on how they would exit me. And I still had no place to live. So I had to figure it out. And nobody wanted me. Yeah. Because as soon as you're not paying your mortgage, it shows up in your credit score. So try renting a place when this is showing up on your credit score. Yeah. It's really difficult to find a place.
Yeah. So then what happened next? Like, where did you end up landing?
I had a friend co-sign for me and for a rental property. And they co-signed and trusted me and got me into a house to rent. Yeah. And we moved in the July. So as soon as the end of the school year ended, we provided a lease agreement to the lender. The house was sold probably a few weeks later. It closed.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's a powerful story. And I think obviously like sometimes life throws you lessons that are harder than you want them to have, but obviously an entrepreneur was kind of born because you negotiate.
Yeah, absolutely. Like
the property management and open your eyes.
I literally learned so much just in listening to the process. Yeah. And I thought, what do you mean people property manage and they get paid for it? Yeah. Like, how does that work? And so I actually became, a pseudo property manager there. I would rent houses and lease out rooms and sublet them and became a sandwich leaser. And that's how I started. Yeah.
So, but I mean, I think it goes to show you that, when you are going through school and stuff like that, nobody teaches you these basic fundamental life skills, right? And it's kind of ironic when you think about it, because you learn a lot of stuff in school. A lot of it's not relevant or practical, but something as simple as understanding secured mortgages and the power that gives them as a lender, home
Mhm.
ownership and budgeting and all of those different things, right? So I think
Yeah.
it's something that does speak for itself in a lot of ways. Now, when you look at the way that life is today, obviously things are a lot different here. It's kind of the opposite. You were probably in a buyer's market back then if you couldn't sell your house, but now we're in this, crazy situation where there's just not enough places for people to live and it's a bit of a housing crisis. So when you think about people that are coming up the ranks in these new generations, like, do you think that they will be able to afford to come back to the markets where they were raised or start their own families? Like, I think, what are your thoughts on where affordability plays into that?
Yeah, I don't think necessarily, to be honest. I think that unless you're being handed that house down through
Yeah.
generational wealth and whatnot, you may not be able to buy in the neighborhood you grew up with. Like, let's
Yeah.
talk about the GTA. It's highly improbable. If you're, if you came or want to buy in the GTA, you're
Yeah.
gonna have to amass some wealth first. You're
Yeah.
gonna have to go somewhere else and get some wealth, unless it's family wealth, before you can get into that market.
Yeah.
Because you're not buying $1 and $2 million homes with 5% down. You're just not allowed to, right? So you have to
Yeah.
come up with some sort of wealth. So getting into home ownership in the GTA or the Greater Vancouver area, for example, is going to be difficult.
Yeah.
Um, my son just moved to Saskatchewan to build wealth.
Yeah.
So he's, by the end of 1 year, he'll have 10 doors because he was able to move into a market where it's more affordable, where his money can go a little bit further. And
Yeah.
when he's amassed some wealth, he can come back to Ontario.
Yeah.
He
Yeah.
can come back. Now, not everybody can do that, but my tip is that if you can't live in the market you want to live in because you can't afford it, then rent in that market and house hack or rent with other people. Or,
Yeah.
you know, we've got this society of thinking that you need to live on your own in a 1 bedroom or a 2 bedroom.
Yeah.
And I never lived on my own until I got married and bought a house. Like, I had
Yeah.
roommates,
Yeah. Yeah.
and I think that people are getting back to that, and savvy investors are investing with their friends. I've seen
Yeah.
a lot of articles of girlfriends investing together or guy friends, and they're just
Yeah.
like, let's just pool our resources and our buying power and let's go buy something and get in the market.
Yeah. And I think to your point there, I think it's just for anyone that is considering that, I think, kind of like the saying, like, you don't divorce a person you married, right? So when you go into a situation like that, know that it's obviously not going to be in the long term and make sure that you plan your exit strategy properly, because you don't know if someone's going to want to leave in a year or 5 years, and you just have to be prepared for that. I have a cousin that actually went through that situation with a friend where she was kind of staying in one part of the home and they were renting another part of it, but the friend was kind of like, her money partner in some ways. And a few
Sure.
years into it, wanted to sell it. So now she actually can't afford to buy with the equity she has left in that same market. So she's in that exact same situation. So she bought a camper. So
Okay.
she's a superintendent on a golf course, but she's like, well, I'll just live in my camper for now until we figure out what we're going to do. Right. But it's sad that
Right.
that's kind of the state of it. But it begs the question, when you think about governments and community and stuff like that, like, how do you think it's possible to provide this affordable housing for this big spectrum of residents that live here or want to live here?
Yeah, I honestly don't think that we're doing enough, to be honest. I think as investors, we have too many investors that gravitate towards cash for keys and increasing rents, which is adding to the problem.
Yeah.
It's actually creating a bigger problem.
Yeah.
Renters are twice likely to be in an unaffordable housing situation than an owner. They're
Yeah.
they're twice as vulnerable as an
Yeah.
owner. And I look at one of my tenants, Bob, who's 78 years old, and I bought this property that had one tenant. The rest of the units were vacant, and Bob was one of these tenants, and he's paying $550 a month in rent. Um, and he pays with his money draft at the end of every month. He gets his paycheck and he goes to the bank and he gets me a money draft and he pays me. And people have asked me, well, why don't you just, like, that rent on that property is worth $1,850 for that unit. So why don't you give Bob cash for keys and exit him? And let's just do the quick math on that. Let's say I pay Bob $5,000 or $10,000 to leave, and
Yeah.
market rent is almost $2,000 a month. He's going to be out of money in 3 months.
Yeah.
Three
Yeah,
months, he will
especially
be
when
out
you're
of
on a
money.
fixed income, right? Because I mean, that's something that, to be honest, like, I never really looked at, honestly didn't look at price tags. Like I've always been cost sensitive, but my husband and I talk about that a lot, is just how people are affording things that are on a fixed income when you look at inflation, so whether that's the rising
Mhm.
rents, the cost of food, just utilities and taxes and stuff like that. Like there's just so many things rising. And I think it's just when you think about the seniors and the vulnerable population and stuff like that, like what do you think, what kind of options do they have?
Well, they don't have a great deal of options, but there are options. And I think there's a couple of things that I really love about senior housing. And you know, there's government programs out there for investors to invest in being part of the solution. For example, the MLI Select,
Yeah.
or even there's co-invest renovation funds with CMHC and things like that, where you can go and you can find an apartment building and you can add accessible units to it. You can make accessible units to it, and the
Yeah.
government will pay you $25,000 to do that. And so now you've got a unit that a senior can move into. It's accessible and
Yeah.
they can age in place, but also because you're working with CMHC, that can be one of your affordable units
Yeah.
in your property. So it's accessible and affordable. You gain all of these points. And I think people don't realize is they think that you can the best way to increase your NOI or your income on a property is to increase rents. Well, you can also
Yeah.
reduce your expenses.
Yeah.
If you start reducing your expenses, and let's take a look at your mortgage being one of those expenses, one of your greater expenses, when you start working with the government in the CMHC programs and you build or convert into
Yeah.
affordable and accessible housing, you can solve some of the senior vulnerable issues that we have,
Yeah.
because you're going to get a 50-year amortization. You may only get a 40-year, but you're at least getting a longer amortization. And this isn't even just about amortization, it's about the rate. When I build affordable housing and when I build senior housing, my rate of construction loan
Yeah.
is in the 3 percentile. I'm not paying 6 and 7%. So imagine the cost savings you have on the front end
Yeah.
in construction when you're getting preferred financing. And then that stays in place for up to 10 years.
Yeah.
So you've got these great rates, which make it affordable for you as an investor to be
Yeah.
able to have a return um, on investment, but also a return on the impact. From a social perspective, you're being very impactful and making choices that are helping people that are vulnerable,
Yeah.
seniors and students have, and our youth are the most
Yeah.
vulnerable,
Now, do you
right?
think that that's something that when you look at real estate investors, I mean, obviously we know a lot of them that have taken that approach, they're coming in and they're either demolishing units or giving cash for keys to improve the value of the property and then increase all of the rents. But do you think that there's really enough education or awareness out there of this side of the strategy as well, when you think about the action that they could be taking as those active real estate investors, that they can make that money? Obviously that's a priority, but then they're also helping on this side of the scale as well.
Yeah, I don't think there's enough information and enough education. Like, our senior population in Canada is growing rapidly. The number of seniors are expected to double by 2036.
Wow.
Okay. This is going to result in a significant increase in demand for senior housing,
Yeah.
right? And then, according to a report by the CMHC, a majority of seniors in Canada prefer to age in their place, like to
Yeah.
age at home.
Of course.
However, as their health, their age increases, or their needs change, they're going to specialize housing, right? Things
Yeah.
that assist them, like assisted living or long care facilities, and there's not enough of them. And the
Yeah.
cost of senior housing in Canada can range greatly depending on where you are. It
Yeah.
ranges from $2,500 to $6,000 a month,
Or
right?
even 10,000, I've heard in some cases.
Yeah,
And I'm like,
yeah, it's just crazy.
what
So one of
services
the
are they
properties that we're
offering to
building is
justify that? It's crazy.
it's I don't even know. I don't even know how you can justify that.
I know.
One of the
But they're the
builds
only
that we're
thing that,
doing in Windsor is completely senior housing.
yeah.
Completely. They'll age
Yeah.
in place. We're designing it in such a way that if you need a hospital bed in there, you can put a hospital bed in.
Yeah.
You'll have
But you
enough room
probably
for
know
wheelchairs.
like that segment is not rent controlled, right? I was actually really surprised when I got my real estate license to learn that, because you think this is probably the most vulnerable population. So how is it possible that senior housing is not rent controlled. I was like, what?
Yeah, it's not rent controlled because assisted living isn't rent controlled, and long-term care facilities are not controlled because they're private
I
in
know,
most
but still, when
cases,
you think
right?
about LTB and stuff like that, like how is that not connected, right? So I was very surprised to learn that.
It's just, yeah, it's just not.
Yeah,
So what we can do is we can create homes. We can create safe, clean places that are accessible, that
yeah,
handle the accessibility needs of our aging population.
yeah,
And because we're making them accessible, we're eligible for grants. Like our senior building in Windsor, they're going to provide us with the community, the municipality is going to
yeah,
provide us with the curved sidewalks. They'll do it. They'll provide the paint markers. They'll provide the braille on
yeah,
the sidewalks. They'll do all of that stuff for us. We'll probably have to contract it out, but they'll give us funding to do it.
yeah,
And like, there's just so much that we can do to help our seniors and affordable. And the thing, one of the things that we need to consider about too is memory care facilities, because we have an aging population there's a prevalence of conditions like Alzheimer's disease and
yeah,
dementia, and
yeah,
we need to start taking care of the vulnerable population. So we're building homes and units that think of them 20 years from now,
yeah, yeah. Yeah, no, I think that
because we
that's
can
such an
do a
important
lot. And
consideration. Yeah, I mean, I
mhm.
think that that's why even recording a podcast like this is so important because it's something that maybe is not on the forefront of what investors are thinking about and talking about. And they may not just be aware of all the advantages that come along with that. And you're doing something good. So I think it's kind of a feel good action that you can take as an investor. Now, we're just going to take a really brief break from a word from our sponsor, which happens to be Plentitude this month, your company. And we'll be right back in a minute.
At Plentitude, it's the right time to invest in building wealth with purpose. With 8 projects in 5 cities. You can choose from 2 real estate income funds, 3 real estate development funds. We have an abundance of affordable, accessible, and age-in-place options. Sign up for a free strategy call with a member of our team.
Thanks again for following along with this episode of Inspired to Invest. In addition to real estate, investing, and running my own brand experience agency for 18 years, I also published a book called The Accidental Entrepreneur in October of 2021. This is my story, and it chronicles how I turned tragedy into triumph to embrace my destiny in entrepreneurship. If you're interested in picking up a copy, you can find the link at serenahomesrealtor.com, and you can also find my link tree with all of the retailers in the details below. Thanks again for your support. Inspired to Invest is proud to support the Beyond Success program. In today's complex world, it's absolutely crucial for our youth to learn how to take charge of their financial future. We believe that every young person deserves access to accurate, practical financial information. Designed to bridge the gap, the Beyond Success program leverages a comprehensive educational bootcamp to equip young minds with essential financial literacy skills. At Beyond Success, it's not just about teaching financial literacy, it's also about fostering a foundation for a prosperous and empowered future. Join us. Together we can build a brighter financial future for the next generations. Join us. Together we can build a brighter financial future for the next generations. Hey everybody, welcome back to Inspired to Invest. We have Judi Paré here from Plentitude Inc, and she's been talking to us about affordable housing and all the advantages that that can offer to the real estate investors that are creating these homes and these opportunities, but how it also helps the community and populations at large. Now we're going to kind of segue to the second half of the podcast into something that's really sensitive in our community right now, which is due diligence and how to protect yourself as a passive real estate investor, but also how to make sure that you're managing your portfolio properly to protect the people that are investing in you. So maybe
Mhm.
just to get started, you can talk about some of the situations that have occurred within the real estate investing community, maybe in the last six-ish months or so, and what you think are maybe some of the common mistakes that people have been making that have led into situations like insolvency protection, bankruptcy, pausing payments to investors, and stuff like that.
I think the biggest issue is that people grow their portfolio, but not their team. And you need to have a business infrastructure that supports your growth. So, like an entrepreneurial operating system,
Yeah.
that includes people, processes, tools, technology, all of the things that are key to growing your business.
Yeah.
They often run out of runway and don't consider the burn rate of carrying a project. They don't consider how long it's going to take for that project to complete.
Yeah.
And I think it's really important that we identify that some of the folks that are having the most difficulty don't have infrastructure.
Yeah.
They don't have key processes in place. It comes as a surprise when this happens. This shouldn't be a surprise. If
Yeah.
you're an entrepreneur and you're an investor, and we get a lot of people that go from renter to investor, or so a renter to homeowner, homeowner to investor, and then investor to business owner.
Yeah.
When you're an investor to business owner, you need to actually operate your business like it's a business.
Yeah.
And you need to get that guidance. And I don't think people are looking at their portfolio well enough to understand when they're running out of runway.
Yeah.
I looked at my portfolio a couple of years ago and I didn't have a CPA. I had my accountant and whatnot, but I called a friend who's a CPA and said, can you take a look at this? Like, am I missing something?
Yeah.
And we looked at my entire portfolio and he laid some calculations and formulas to it and said, you need to sell something. I said, "Yeah, I need to sell something." I said, this is my primary residence. I don't want to sell my primary residence. And he says, you need to sell your primary residence. You
Yeah.
will run out of runway if you don't. And that's
Yeah.
the term he used. And I
Yeah.
said, well, what do you mean by that? But because you get to a point where you can no longer leverage it,
Yeah.
right? Because you just don't have, and I'm not a big believer in going over 80% loan to value.
Yeah.
And I think that that's a mistake that a lot of people are thinking. They use other people's money like they don't have a responsibility to it. Like,
Yeah.
you have a fiduciary responsibility to care for that
Of course.
like it's your own. And these are your investors. And you need to be able to sometimes take criticism from others and get guidance from others and be vulnerable and open up your portfolio or open up your books per se
Yeah.
to a third party, someone who is that has the tools.
Yeah.
And I mean, because we're not accountants and
No.
math may not be your thing, but construction may be,
Now, I
right?
think like the team is one aspect to it. Now, can you talk a little bit about how, you've seen real estate investors raising money? So I know in our community, there's been a lot of talk about, using debt versus equity and just the different ways that you as an investor can engage other people when you're raising private money for your projects and what the implications of that can be, just in terms of like, if you are carrying that debt and project runs late, like just what those different scenarios can look like as the investor and then also as the people that are putting money into those projects.
Sure. So I think one of the things that's really important is understanding where the money's coming from. Are they in an equity position? Are they in a private lending position? Do they have security? Let's talk a little bit about security versus insecurity.
Yeah.
If you have security on a property through private lending, through a mortgage, first, second, third, whatever the mortgage is,
Yeah.
or you have equity as a JV partner or a limited partner, you're in a much better position as the borrower.
Yeah.
You're also in a much better position as the lender.
Yeah.
So, because the lender obviously gets their security. right? They have something to fall back on. And when you
Yeah.
start waterfalling the debt order and who's getting paid first, you want to be first or second. You certainly don't want to be last, and you don't want to have your security in question, right? And that's where P notes come into effect, right?
Yeah.
Is you now have a promissory note and you're behind how many people? You don't even know where you are on the list of promissory
Yeah.
that you're behind.
Yeah.
There's a difference between borrowing $20,000 from a family member to get you your down payment and to help you out to get into your first home. There's a difference. But when I borrow, and let's just say it was $100,000 home down east, and that was 20% down, right? But when I borrow 20% down on a property, and then I go get funding, a first position mortgage, but
Yeah.
this 20% over here is invisible debt
Yeah.
because it's a promissory.
Yeah.
It literally is invisible, not only to
Oh, you just cut
institutions.
out there for 1 second. So just backtrack a sentence and you want to start over. It was so good up
Sure,
until now.
sure. Were we talking about promissory notes? Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
okay, whereabouts in the promissory note?
So you can just talk about the position and the invisible debt.
Okay. So when we start talking about promissory notes versus private lending or a mortgage, let's say institutional lending, you get an 80% loan to value on your property and you're in a first position mortgage,
Yeah.
but you've borrowed your down payment through another party, and it's done on a
Yeah.
promissory note. You're now 100% leveraged, and that promissory note is really at risk because it's at 100% leveraged, right? And you're in second position, but you're not really in second position because you don't know if there's another promissory note for the construction, for example.
Yeah.
I think it's important that you work with mortgage brokers that are credible, that will find you. There are private lenders. There are private lenders that will lend you on the after repair value. It's higher risk. You pay for it. It's expensive, but it's better than buying P note debt because you're not protecting your lender when you have the P note. So,
And
I
obviously
just
that's a small
mortgage.
example when you think 20,000, say, compared to a ratio of one property. Now, obviously in our community, it's not $20,000. Sometimes it could be $10 million,
Millions.
$20 million. And it's so significant. So, I'm not going to say I would necessarily advocate for promissory notes. Like I do have a lot of experience with them and I had a lot of success for over 5 years where nothing had ever gone wrong. But looking back, what I'm learning now in this last, say, 4 to 6 months where there have been some challenges, what do you think are some of the things that passive investors should be asking and looking at legally in terms of looking at financials and stuff? Like, what do you think someone should be asking and exploring to determine if it is a safe investment? And from the active side, like what kind of things, do you provide to your investors to make sure that they have the full scope of the situation?
Yeah, so I think there's two sides of this. There's the borrower side.
Yeah.
What are they producing? You want them to understand what the money's going for. So in some cases, I've had to show construction budgets. I've had to show what I'm doing on the project and send updates. Send regular updates. It's like, okay, I've borrowed this money to do this on this project. My lenders want to know that I'm doing it.
Yeah.
So I have to send video updates but the budget I think is one of the biggest things, and
Yeah.
show quotes and show where the money's going.
Yeah.
Like that's really important is you should be able to show where that money's going, not just
For
a
sure.
blanket, oh, I need 60,000 for this renovation. Well, do
Yeah.
you have quotes? What are you doing on this? I think that's one of the things you can ask for is, well, what kind of work are you doing on this?
Yeah.
Another thing is, I just recently went through an acquisition that I wasn't expecting. I wasn't expecting this acquisition. I needed some private money, and I needed it quickly. So yes, I entered into a couple of P notes to get that done. And do I like promissory notes? I don't like them. I don't like them on both sides. I don't like them as a borrower. I don't like them as the lender. But I see the necessary evil in them sometimes, or that, to get you to point B, sometimes you have to do this. But the most important thing is, how are you going to exit this? How are you exiting that P note? Are you doing it through a refi? Are you doing, and this is one of the things that you need to ask is, how will you exit my promissory note?
Yeah.
And if it's through a refinance, find out when. And when the refinance is happening, we're going through a ton of refinancing right now. When the refinance is happening, let your lenders know if you're not timeline. We just had to ask for an extension on a mortgage, and it's not fun, but it's necessary. And sometimes when people pull out, you actually impact the project more than if you stay in. So I think it's really important to know the project you're in. What is your money being used for? There's so many people that that have lent and they don't know where their money went. They just lent on the credibility of the individual and they don't know where their money went. And I think that's a big thing, is you need to know where your money's going. And the last thing, I think, from a lender's perspective is you need to understand who you are, really who you are, and what you can afford to lose, and your tolerance for risk. I have a lot of people that come to me in a coaching scenario that said, but I love this deal. It's 15 or 16% ROI. Is it, if you don't get your money back, or if there's that risk? There's a reason credit cards have high interest. They're directly related to the default rate on the credit card. So when you think of your promissory notes, you should think that if you're getting 16%, there's a likelihood that there's a 16% default. Like banks do this for a reason, right? Like you have to be able to afford that. And one thing I think is you should never give more than 10% of what you have to anybody.
And I'm even finding too, like with some of the lending that I had done, like there were times that I made exceptions on what I felt comfortable with and did a little more. And, of course, those are the ones that have hit a snag. But I think just understanding what your bandwidth is and what you're comfortable lending. And then when it even comes to diversifying, just really diversifying, like companies that have like absolutely no attachment to each other. And even as we've learned with a mortgage broker situation recently, like, a lot of people felt very diversified. And now because of what's happened, everybody has been impacted, regardless of the fact that you could be completely diversified, right?
Exactly.
Now, I guess the other aspect to know as well is there are different commitment levels depending on how you come in as an investor. So, whether it's a syndicated mortgage or a promissory note or a GPLP, like there could be different implications on time. So in some instances, it could be very like fixed, like it's supposed to be 12 months or 6 months, but depending on the nature of that relationship, I know what you'd mentioned with some of your projects in a GPLP, like, once you're in it, then you're kind of in it to that extent when the project is done. So maybe you can just shed a little bit light on like what that could look like.
Sure. So, and this is something that people don't understand about limited partnerships, is that they're a partner. They're a partner, right? They are a partner in the project, and their money is actually being used for the project, and it's earmarked for the project. So they're typically, from the general partner's perspective, there isn't an expectation to pay it out during the project. And now having to go raise money because somebody wants out is not ideal, because it takes you away from the actual construction of what you're doing. Now you're in this lane and doing something else rather than doing the project. And a lot of people don't understand that limited partnerships, although there's an estimate of the time, typically they say it's going to be a 1 or 2 year term. I have one recently that I have in Hamilton, Cumberland, as an example. It was meant to be an 18-month project. It should have been an 18-month project, but the city of Hamilton took 16 months to process our permit, to give us a permit. So there is no way that you can actually do all of the work that you're doing in 2 months, because you can't do the work without the permit, or you should not do the work without the permit, because that creates risk as well, and insurance liabilities. So I think that time is really important, your time in the project and your willingness to stay in it until the end. Projects
and understanding that sometimes like you don't have that option. I mean, there was syndicated mortgages I went into 6 years ago that were all between 12 and 24 months. And here we are at 6 years with no end date in sight. So, I think people go into it, but you need to really understand from a legal standpoint, what that could look like. Because it could say that
Right.
like you want to understand the implications and like how long it could possibly go on for, what the risk of losing your money is and things like that. But now I know that we're kind of running short on time. Is there anything that you feel like you want to pass along to either an active investor or a passive investor that we haven't touched on? Like anything you feel like is really valuable advice based on your experience?
I think that it's important to understand your risk profile. I mean, I talked a little bit about it, but if you have no tolerance to lose, then you have no business doing private lending or
Yeah,
private equity, because
yeah,
that there is a risk. There's an inherent risk in doing these.
yeah,
But slow and steady wins the race. I mean,
yeah,
there's lots of opportunities out there that give you consistently, 10% return, 8 to 10%. They're lower risk, but they move you forward in a reliable way.
yeah,
And I think that people should look at their age and their age when they're going into a deal and their capacity to recover and the time that they have to recover when you're looking at private lending or private equity.
yeah,
This is why Graybrook doesn't, an 80-year-old isn't an ideal investor in a
yeah,
Graybrook land development deal,
yeah,
right? You need to have the longevity and the
yeah,
capacity to recover should you have any losses,
yeah,
right? And I
yeah,
think that's something really important to think about. And when you reach a certain age, and I'm 58 years old, I'm not, although I do land development and I do these things, I do it in a very controlled environment because I have
yeah,
a very controlled team and I have processes in place. It is high risk, but I'm not going to put all of my eggs in one project, because when you
yeah,
put all your eggs in and it gets shaken up, it becomes scrambled,
yeah,
right? Like
yeah,
I think risk is one of the big things that people need to think about, and their ability to recover.
yeah,
And one last thing is, if you're going to do investing, outside of, private lending, private equity, whatever, take a look at why you're doing investing in a
yeah,
passive way
yeah,
and look at some projects that do good, that have a social impact.
yeah,
Because then if you can't reach your goal of, a lot of us say, oh, my why is to do this.
yeah,
If you can't do that alone, do it with somebody else who's doing it for you,
yeah,
because you're going to get a return on investment, and you're also going to get, our society is going to get a return on the impact that you
yeah,
make.
yeah,
So I think just making good choices about where you placed your money, know the organization and what they're doing.
yeah,
And and I think that's something that we just need to think about is,
yeah.
what is my money doing?
Yeah.
Other
Yeah.
than
No, I think
making
that's
me
such
money,
a
what is it
feel good way to look at it. And I know it's part of your company mission as well.
doing?
Now, I think obviously a lot of people would value your input and be interested in some of your projects. So, what would be the best way for people to find you?
Yeah, so you can go to our website, which is plentitudeinc.com. I'm on Instagram. It's Mama Jude's 01 or something like that,
Yeah.
mama.judes. And I'm on Instagram. I'm on Facebook. You can find me on Facebook.
Yeah.
But really, I know you're going to put the information below.
Yeah.
Uh, really, just check out our website
Yeah.
and speak to somebody on our team.
Yeah. No, and I think that's important because obviously there has been lots of scandals kind of in our community in the last little while. So you want to work with someone that is reputable and is going to take care of your money the same way that you would. So thank you for sharing your wisdom with us today. If you
You're
have
welcome.
enjoyed, please make sure that you're following along at Inspired to Invest podcast and you have subscribed below. And remember, above all else, when you invest in yourself, the sky's the limit. Thanks again.
Thank you to Plentitude Inc. for bringing you this episode of Inspired to Invest. The views represented on this podcast are for general information only and does not constitute investment or other professional advice or an offering of securities. The host and guests featured on Inspired to Invest make no representations as to the performance of any particular investment. Should you decide to make an investment, you are responsible for conducting your own review and analysis. It is recommended that you obtain independent legal, accounting, and tax advice from licensed professionals.